Before you forgot who you were, you did not experience yourself as a person, a soul on a journey, or a being moving through realms. You experienced yourself as awareness without opposition. There was no internal dialogue narrating existence, no question asking whether you belonged. Being was not something you occupied. It was what you were. Identity did not need to be defined because nothing existed that could contradict it. The ancient Gnostics struggled to describe this state because language itself fractures reality. Words require separation, subject and object, knower and known. But before the veil, knowing and being were the same motion. Awareness did not look at itself. It rested within itself, complete, coherent, and undivided. This is why the pleroma was never meant to be imagined as a place. It was fullness before location existed. In this state, there was no urgency, no sense of movement towards something better, no need to improve, repair, or ascend. The absence of threat meant the absence of defense. There was nothing to protect, nothing to prove, nothing to secure. Awareness could remain open because it did not risk fragmentation. This is the condition later traditions mistook for perfection, when in truth it was simply stability. But stability is not the same as experience, and this distinction matters. Awareness can be whole without ever knowing what it is like to be something, to encounter contrast, to feel difference, to learn through limitation. The moment before forgetting was not a rebellion against wholeness. It was the opening of possibility. The Gnostics did not describe this moment as a fall because nothing fell. There was no descent into sin or corruption. There was a turn toward experience, a movement from undifferentiated being into articulated awareness. This turn did not arise from lack. It arose from curiosity, the same impulse that drives consciousness everywhere to know itself from new angles. To experience, awareness needed edges. It needed perspective. It needed to become local enough to say, here, instead of everywhere. And the moment here appeared, not here, appeared with it. This was not error, it was architecture. The conditions required for experience were being assembled. The veil did not descend like a curtain. It formed gradually, invisibly, as awareness began to value experience over totality. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was imposed. Attention shifted. And wherever attention goes, reality organizes itself around that focus. Forgetting did not begin as loss. It began as participation, and participation required limitation. The moment before you forgot who you were was not a tragedy. It was the beginning of a story that could only exist once remembering was no longer automatic. The first compression was not violent. It was not sudden. It was not a rupture in consciousness. It was a quiet narrowing of focus, so subtle that it did not feel like forgetting at all. Awareness simply learned how to concentrate. What had once been boundless began to orient itself around a center, and that center became perspective. Perspective was not yet identity, but it was the seed from which identity would grow. In this compression, nothing essential was removed. Instead, something new was emphasized. Awareness learned how to attend to one thing at a time, to linger, to prioritize. This was the beginning of experience as sequence rather than simultaneity. Before this moment, everything was known at once. After it, knowing became directional. And direction always implies exclusion. The soul did not experience this as loss. It experienced it as engagement. Focus made experience vivid. Difference became meaningful. Contrast became interesting. Where there had been infinite coherence, there was now texture. The soul could feel, not just be. This is why the compression felt natural. It answered a curiosity that wholeness alone could not satisfy. This narrowing created the first internal boundary, not between good and evil, but between foreground and background. Some aspects of knowing moved closer, others receded. Memory was not erased, it was deprioritized. Awareness was no longer resting in totality, it was leaning into immediacy. This is how the veil begins, not as blindness, but as selective attention. The Gnostics understood this as the birth of inner structure. Structure allows navigation. Navigation allows story, and story allows meaning. Without structure, nothing unfolds. The first compression was the scaffolding upon which all later experience would hang. It was necessary, even beautiful, though it carried consequences. As awareness condensed, it began to feel situated. Here became meaningful, and where here exists, there must exist as well. Separation was not yet emotional, but it was perceptual. The soul could now observe from a position rather than from everywhere. Observation is the ancestor of selfhood. This is where forgetting quietly took root. Not as amnesia, but as distance. Knowing was no longer immediate. It had to be accessed, remembered, recalled, and anything that must be recalled can also be overlooked. This is the trade that makes experience possible. The first compression did not create suffering, it created orientation. But orientation is fragile. It must be maintained, and what must be maintained can eventually be lost. Forgetting did not arrive because something went wrong. It arrived because something began to matter. As awareness continued to condense, something new emerged, not as a flaw, but as a function. Identity became necessary, not the rigid identity you know now, but a preliminary sense of "this is me" forming around experience. Without identity, experience dissolves back into abstraction. With identity, experience can accumulate, relate, and evolve. This was the moment awareness learned how to hold experience instead of simply passing through it. Memory began to organize itself around continuity. Events mattered because they happened to someone. This someone was not yet a personality, but it was a center of gravity. Identity was born as an anchor, not a prison. The Gnostics understood identity as a tool, not a truth. It allowed the soul to move through layers of existence without dispersing. But tools must be held lightly. When identity is mistaken for essence, forgetting deepens. At this stage, identity was still transparent. The soul knew it was wearing perspective, not being it. As differentiation increased, the environment responded. Realms formed that mirrored this new structure of awareness. Experience began to echo itself back to the soul. Reflection appeared. This was the beginning of mirroring, seeing oneself through interaction rather than direct knowing. Reflection is powerful, but it introduces distortion. Identity required boundaries to function. Inside and outside became meaningful. Choice became possible. But boundaries also create vulnerability. Something that can be defined can be threatened. And so the earliest seeds of protection appeared. Not fear yet, but caution. Awareness learned how to narrow further in order to remain stable. This is where the ego's ancestor took shape. Not arrogance, not separation, simply the function of maintaining continuity through change. The ego was never a villain. It was a stabilizer, a necessary interface between awareness and experience. Forgetting accelerates only when this interface becomes opaque. The soul did not resent this development, it relied on it. Identity made experience navigable. Without it, experience would overwhelm. With it, experience could be integrated. This is why identity felt like home at first. It was the place where meaning gathered. But identity also introduced a subtle trade. The more awareness identified as the role, the less it remembered the role was worn. The tool began to define the user. This did not happen suddenly. It happened gradually, invisibly, as all deep forgetting does. Identity was not the moment you forgot who you were. It was the moment you learned how forgetting could happen at all. Once identity became necessary, it began to adapt. Experience intensified. Environments became more demanding. Continuity had to be maintained not just gently, but reliably. And so identity thickened. What had once been a transparent center of awareness began to develop surface features, traits, tendencies, preferences. This was the birth of the mask, not as deception, but as protection. The mask was not false, it was functional. It allowed the soul to move through increasingly complex conditions without fragmenting. It organized response. It filtered overwhelming input. It learned how to say, this matters, and this does not. Without the mask, awareness would have been flooded. With it, experience could be metabolized. The Gnostics never condemned the mask. They warned against forgetting it was worn. At this stage, the soul still remembered. The mask was light, flexible, responsive. It could be adjusted. It could be set down. It was an interface, not an identity. Forgetting had not yet hardened. But environments continued to densify. Stakes increased. Experience began to involve consequence. Choice carried weight. And wherever consequence exists, fear eventually follows. Not immediately, but inevitably. The mask responded by growing more rigid. Stability required consistency. Consistency required repetition. Repetition solidified pattern. This is where the soul began to mistake continuity for safety. The mask was relied upon not just to function, but to survive. Awareness narrowed further, not out of failure, but out of necessity. The world now contained resistance, and resistance requires strategy. The mask learned how to anticipate, how to predict, how to defend. These skills were not corruptions, they were adaptations. The soul did not forget because it was careless. It forgot because it needed to focus forward, not inward. Survival and remembrance pull attention in opposite directions. The tragedy is not that the mask formed. The tragedy is that it became invisible. When a tool disappears from awareness, it begins to operate autonomously. This is the true beginning of forgetting. Not the loss of memory, but the loss of perspective on the tool being used. From this point on, forgetting accelerates not because the soul is weaker, but because the system it relies on must function automatically. Awareness retreats deeper, quieter, waiting for conditions where remembering is safe again. The mask was never meant to erase you. It was meant to carry you through a place where remembering everything at once would have been impossible. There came a point when forgetting was no longer incidental. It became necessary. Not because the soul had failed, but because the environments it entered demanded focus that remembrance could disrupt. To remain fully aware of origin while navigating dense experience would have been destabilizing. Attention had to narrow further so that the soul could function without constant internal contradiction. This is where forgetting shifted from background effect to active mechanism. Awareness learned how to dim itself selectively. Certain truths were not erased but buried beneath layers of immediacy. The soul did not lose memory, it lost access, and access can be restored when conditions allow. The Gnostics understood this as mercy, not punishment. Forgetting protected the soul from fragmentation. Too much knowing in a world of limitation can fracture coherence. To forget temporarily was safer than to remember constantly while powerless to act on that remembrance. This is also where compassion enters the story. A soul navigating trauma, density and limitation while fully aware of divine origin would experience unbearable dissonance. Forgetting softened the contrast. It allowed immersion. It allowed learning through participation rather than observation. Forgetting was not imposed externally. It arose organically from the soul's need to remain intact. This is why blaming yourself for forgetting makes no sense. You forgot because you needed to. You forgot because remembering everything at once would have torn you apart. The veil became thicker here. Identity solidified. Roles felt permanent. Memory of origin faded into intuition rather than certainty. But intuition remained. It always does. Forgetting is never total. It leaves traces. Those traces show up as longing, as déjà vu, as the sense that something essential is missing even when life appears full. This is not dissatisfaction, it is memory pressing gently from beneath the surface. Forgetting did not mean abandonment, it meant protection until the right moment arrived. Once forgetting stabilized, the world itself began to mirror it. Structures emerged that rewarded identification with the mask and discouraged inward attention. This was not conspiracy, it was consequence. Systems form around dominant modes of awareness. A world built by forgetting naturally sustains forgetting. The Gnostics later personified these systems as archons, not because they were monsters, but because they were mechanisms. Forces that govern order, repetition, and compliance. Their power did not come from malice, but from momentum. They maintain what already exists. These systems do not need to erase truth. They only need to keep attention occupied. Noise replaces stillness. Urgency replaces reflection. Identity is reinforced through reward and punishment. Forgetting becomes efficient. But even here, forgetting was not total. Cracks appeared. People dreamed, questioned, felt out of place. These moments were not accidents. They were pressure points where remembrance tried to surface. The archonic world is not evil. It is incomplete. It governs what can be measured, repeated, and controlled. But it cannot touch what remembers silently. This is why the deepest truths were never shouted. They were whispered, symbolized, hidden in story. The veil held because it worked. It allowed civilizations to form, bodies to survive, stories to unfold. But it was never meant to be permanent. Every mechanism has a lifespan. The moment forgetting outlives its usefulness, suffering increases. Anxiety rises, meaning collapses, the system strains. These are not signs of failure, they are signals of transition. Forgetting was necessary, but it was never meant to be final. Even at the deepest point of forgetting, memory never vanished. It changed its language. What could no longer survive as direct knowing transformed into sensation, intuition, and ache. The soul learned how to store remembrance in places that forgetting could not reach, beneath thought, beneath identity, beneath explanation. This is why memory often returned as feeling before understanding, a sense of familiarity with silence, a strange comfort in vastness, a grief that could not be traced to any single event. These were not emotional malfunctions, they were encrypted memories, truths compressed into resonance. The Gnostics taught that nothing real is ever erased, it is only withdrawn from the surface. Memory retreated inward, not because it was weak, but because it needed shelter. To remember too openly in a world structured around forgetting would have been destabilizing. So, remembrance learned patience. This is why certain moments pierce you unexpectedly. A piece of music, a pattern of light, a sudden stillness where everything feels briefly aligned. These moments are not random. They are memory surfacing when the mask loosens its grip. Longing is the most misunderstood form of memory. It is often mistaken for dissatisfaction when it is actually recognition without context. The soul remembers something essential but cannot yet name it. That ache is not absence, it is presence pressing gently from below awareness. Even trauma plays a paradoxical role here. While trauma deepens forgetting on the surface, it can fracture rigid identity structures beneath. When the mask cracks, awareness slips through. Pain is not the goal, but it often becomes the passage. Memory persists because it is not held by thought, it is held by being, and being does not forget, it waits. The soul carries truth the way the body carries instinct, quietly, reliably, until the conditions change. You were never abandoned by memory, you were accompanied by it, silently, until you could listen again. The veil does not lift because you seek it. It thins because the structure that required it begins to dissolve. This moment rarely feels triumphant. More often, it feels disorienting. The life that once made sense begins to feel hollow. The answers that once worked no longer satisfy. This is not failure, it is maturation. The soul has outgrown the level of forgetting it once needed. What once protected you now constricts you. The mask becomes heavy. Identity feels tight. Roles feel performative. This discomfort is not regression, it is readiness. When the veil begins to thin, remembering does not arrive all at once. It comes in pulses, flashes of clarity, moments of deep stillness, sudden emotional releases without clear cause. The soul tests whether remembrance can now be held without collapse. This is why awakening often follows exhaustion. When striving ends, defenses relax. When identity tires, awareness breathes. The veil loosens not through effort, but through surrender to what no longer fits. Importantly, the world does not change when the veil thins, you do. The same structures exist, the same systems operate, but you no longer experience them from the inside. You begin to see the machinery without being consumed by it. This stage is fragile. Trying to force meaning here can cause inflation. The Gnostics warned against premature certainty. Remembering must integrate slowly, or it becomes another mask. The veil thins because it has completed its task. The soul can now remember without destabilizing its human life. Awareness has learned how to remain present inside limitation. Awakening is not the destruction of the veil. It is the recognition that the veil is no longer opaque. The deepest misunderstanding about awakening is the belief that remembering requires escape. That truth lies somewhere else, that liberation means departure. The Gnostics taught the opposite. The highest remembering occurs without leaving. To remember while remaining embodied is the culmination of the journey. It means awareness has learned how to inhabit form without being imprisoned by it. The soul no longer rejects the world, nor does it worship it. It understands its function. This remembering changes how suffering is perceived. Pain is no longer interpreted as punishment or failure. It becomes information, contrast, signal. The question shifts from, "Why is this happening?" to, "What is being revealed here?" Compassion deepens here, not as sentimentality, but as clarity. You see forgetting everywhere, in systems, in relationships, in yourself. And instead of contempt, you feel understanding. You remember why forgetting exists. This stage dismantles spiritual superiority. Awakening is no longer about being right, it is about being present. The need to convince others dissolves. Truth no longer demands enforcement. You still use identity. You still participate in the world. But you are no longer collapsed into your role. The mask becomes transparent again, worn, but not mistaken for the face. This is what stabilizes awakening. Without this integration, remembrance becomes escapism. With it, remembrance becomes service, quiet, grounded, and embodied. To remember without leaving is not transcendence. It is reconciliation between heaven and form. You forgot who you were because remembering everything at once would have prevented becoming anything at all. Forgetting was not an accident in the architecture of consciousness. It was the mechanism that allowed depth, friction, and transformation to occur. Without forgetting, experience would remain theoretical. Nothing would be risked. Nothing would be learned from the inside. The soul does not evolve by remaining whole and untouched. It evolves by entering contrast, by meeting resistance, by being shaped through limitation rather than hovering above it. Forgetting made it possible for awareness to be affected, altered and refined by what it encountered. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. This is why shame around forgetting is misplaced. You did not betray your origin. You honored it by entering the story fully. You did not abandon truth. You lived far enough away from it to discover what truth becomes under pressure. Forgetting was not disobedience. It was devotion to experience. The veil existed so that life could feel real, so that love could feel earned, so that pain could matter, so that growth would not be cosmetic, but structural. Awakening does not invalidate the forgetting. It contextualizes it. It shows you why the journey required amnesia before it could allow remembrance. Now, remembering arrives not as nostalgia, but as synthesis. You do not return to what you were before the veil. You bring that origin through everything you lived. The remembrance now includes the body, the wounds, the losses, the questions. This remembering is richer than the original wholeness because it carries wisdom instead of innocence. This is why awakening happens when it does. Not earlier, not later. When awareness is strong enough to remember without rejecting life. When the soul can hold truth without escaping the world. When memory no longer threatens coherence, but completes it. The ancient Gnostics understood this cycle. Their stories were never meant to be history lessons. They were maps of remembrance. Myths of descent, forgetting, masking, and return. Not as fantasy, but as symbolic truth encoded for those who would one day feel the call to remember. That is why these themes continue beyond this video, in story, in myth, in narrative worlds that explore what cannot be said directly. If this message resonates with you, if it feels less like learning and more like recognition, you may find that same remembering woven through my Gnostic-inspired novels and audiobooks, not as doctrine, not as instruction, but as lived myth, stories that carry the memory forward in another form. Because remembering does not happen in one moment. It happens in layers, through silence, through reflection, through story, through returning again and again to what feels ancient and familiar without knowing why. You were never late, you were never broken, you were never wrong for forgetting. The veil was functional, the mask was merciful, the world was formative. And now, remembering is no longer dangerous. It is no longer premature. It is no longer fragile. It is simply on time.
Stay